Let me read to you a passage from the 16th chapter of St. John's Gospel, verses 20 to 23. It's the Gospel for Friday of the 6th week in Eastertide. St. John writes, Jesus said to his disciples, I tell you the truth, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. So with you. Now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. In that day you will no longer ask me anything. I tell you the truth, my Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. That's from John chapter 16, verses 20 to 23. In those words, our Lord refers to suffering. Let us think of that. In that Gospel I've just read, our Lord warns his disciples that you will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. So, suffering is coming to them. Let us for a moment consider the phenomenon of suffering in the universe, so as to understand its presence more clearly in the human being. The pain experienced by an animal is not, of course, the same experience as that of a human being. Just consider the pain of animals, their suffering, as we might call it. Most accept that it is not right for animals to be made to suffer without proper cause. And in any case, most understand that a needless infliction of pain on animals brutalizes society itself. That having been said, the pain of an animal is a radically different phenomenon from the suffering of man. Fundamentally, the animal is but matter. It is but matter. It is endowed with an awareness, and often of a high order, but it lacks any spiritual element in its awareness. It has a power of self-generated activity, but it is not free. The animal acts instinctively and not freely in response to what it is aware of. The animal has no self-awareness properly so called. It is aware only of objects external to itself. It responds to these objects of its awareness according to instinct, and it must act in accord with its instinct. Its instinct is a great endowment, and it protects it, the animal, against threats of pain. Importantly, the animal has no consciousness of its being an independent self. When it is in pain, it is not conscious of its own self as in pain. It is just caught up in its pain. It is aware of the pain because it is paining. But it's not aware of its own self as paining. And this constitutes a profound difference between the suffering of animal and man. Man is above all aware of his being an independent self with inherent dignity, able to choose his own path. An important component of man's suffering is the fact that he is aware of his own self precisely as suffering. Aware of the dignity of his own self, he is aware that his suffering is contingent in the sense that ultimately it need not be, and so his suffering, so undesirable, is all the more repulsive because he sees that his painful condition could be otherwise. Suffering debilitates his self. It degrades him and leaves him ruined. The worst and most mysterious thing about the life of man is that he has to suffer. Suffering is a horror to him. Of course, not all feel the revulsion towards the fact of suffering that some do. In his account of the history of his religious views of 1864, John Henry Newman has a powerful passage on the effect on him of the sight of the evil and suffering in the world. He writes, I look out of myself into the world of men, and there I see a sight which fills me with unspeakable distress. I look into this living, busy world and see no reflection of its creator. The sight of the world is nothing else than a prophet's scroll full of lamentations and mourning and woe. his Apologia Pro Vita Sua, chapter 5, page 250. The general point here is that while all living things experience pain, in the sense that they undergo trauma, attack and decline, in a superior sense it is man who suffers. Further, being conscious of the independent self that he is able to reflect on the fact of his suffering and on the higher purpose that his suffering may have. As man, he senses that this is part of his calling as a human being. He is called to suffer, and he senses that by suffering well, he will improve the world. He then can look on suffering in a different way to the rest of suffering creation. He need not simply endure it. He can see that it has its place in his work for a better world. He has the sense that, properly speaking, it has a higher place for his self than something to be merely endured. By his suffering, he can be a better person, and by it, he can make the world a better place. Within this perspective, let us situate our Lord's words in today's Gospel from John chapter 16, verse 20 to 23. Jesus said to his disciples, "I tell you the truth, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy." The greatest example of human suffering is that of Jesus Christ, and he embraced it as being the plan of God for the salvation of the world. By his sufferings, he took away the sin of the world and made it possible for all things to become new. He is the archetypal man whose sufferings brought joy to the world. If we unite ourselves to him, our sufferings will, as St. Paul writes, fill up what is lacking in his sufferings. Colossians chapter 1, verse 24. Thus, by our sufferings, we become co-redeemers with Christ, who is the one and only Redeemer, with Mary, his mother, being the foremost co-redeemer with him who is the only Redeemer. Suffering is the worst thing about existence, but in another sense, it is the best thing about existence, because we have learnt from the example of the suffering man of the ages, Jesus Christ, that it is the principal path to goodness and to the doing of good. Just as we are called to do good, so we are called to suffer. The key to it is to suffer with the suffering servant who bore the sin of the world through his obedient suffering. Let us then resolve to share in the sufferings of Christ, so as to share in his resurrection. As our Lord says, "Now is the time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy."